As far as the characters in the movie know, nothing bad ever happens in Amsterdam. But then the movie ends in 1933, so David Russell has created another study of misfits in over their head who have to make the decision to join society as it is or build one around themselves that they can live with. Only this time, the world around them might actually be as odd as they are, just not in that quirky, fun way. There's eventually that one who wants to take things too far. Let's take a look at the real events that inspired the movie Amsterdam. Now, while there are really a few different stories going on in this movie, the main thrust of it revolves around a plot to convince a retired Marine general to lead a march on Washington with the ultimate goal of unseating then-President Franklin Roosevelt and installing a more business-friendly figurehead leader. Well, friendly to the businesses behind the plot. The premise of the movie is real, fundamentally. In 1933, General Smedley Butler, a name so fun they had to create a new one for the movie, talked to a reporter and then appeared before a House Congressional Committee detailing a plot that involved him giving a prepared speech at an American Legion gala that was meant to inspire a veterans march on Washington with the express goal of overturning the president. It was eventually dubbed the business plot, as it was headed and funded by some of the more influential business tycoons of the time. Allegedly, that is. The investigation that followed General Butler's testimony confirmed that yes, indeed, there were plans to mobilize over 500,000 veterans for a march supporting a fascist takeover of the United States. Not metaphorically fascist, actual self-labeling fascists. Now, while the movie was based, or more accurately, inspired by real events, even the key players in the story didn't get to keep their original names, not even ones with names as awesome as Smedley Butler. Instead, the general in this movie, played by Robert De Niro, is General Gil Dillenbeck. We learn a lot about General Dillenbeck before we ever see him. We know that he fought in the Boxer Rebellion. We also know that he gave a speech to the Bonus Army where he met Bert and Harold. He relates to our intrepid trio a story that he had heard from Senator Meekins, the man whose death starts this whole ball rolling. Meekins had been in Italy to get an understanding of this rapidly changing Europe. According to Dillenbeck, Meekins told the story of Mussolini having his driver drive over a child blocking his motorcade, saying, "What is one person's life compared to the affairs of state?" This was understandably a big red flag for Meekins, who was then poisoned so he wouldn't tell his friend the general how much he didn't like Mussolini and the fascist government. If that story sounds familiar, you can actually thank General Smedley Butler. In 1931, he recounted that rumor, which is a bit of a no-no for military personnel. The Italian government naturally objected to the story and pressured then-President Wilson to do something about it. Partially because it was in the early days of the fascist revolutions where diplomatic relations still existed, and partially because Hoover hated General Butler, who had been protected by his member of Congress dad. Hoover tapped the Secretary of the Navy and arranged to have Butler court-martialed. Butler apologized, and the court-martial was dropped. Like Dillenbeck, Butler did serve during the Boxer Rebellion, as well as the Spanish-American War, as well as the large number of conflicts that Americans would get in the Caribbean and Central America, in an effort to maintain control of the Panama Canal, as well as protect American business interests in fruit, tobacco, and sugar. Now that might seem like an extraneous detail to add, except it formed the basis of his beliefs once he was no longer in the Marines. Despite being the most decorated Marine up to that point, he was passed over for the top position in the Marines because Wilson still didn't like him, and he was the guy who repeated that rumor about Mussolini. Not getting the top job, he asked to retire. There was a failed run for Congress as part of the pro-prohibition movement, but primarily he went on the lecture circuit, donating much of the proceeds to Philadelphia unemployment relief. In his lectures, naturally, he didn't hold back about what he thought of his service and what he was asked to do. He spoke out against war profiteering and U.S. adventurism, like his time fighting the Banana Wars to protect American business interests. He didn't feel this was the proper use of a nation's military. He was also highly critical of what he saw was the rising threat of fascism within the country, which would make him a strange choice for the plotters. Or the best, because no one is going to accuse the staunch anti-fascist of fostering fascism. Butler did in fact speak to the Bonus Army gathered in front of the Capitol. There was an act of Congress that was meant to give veterans of World War I bonuses, but they were in the form of a kind of treasury note in that they had to wait for them to come into its value, which for many of them wouldn't be until 1945. They wouldn't know at the time that 1945 is gonna be a busy year. With rampant unemployment, especially among veterans, they gathered at the Capitol and suggested maybe now was the time to give them their bonus. Hoover said no and had their encampment destroyed. Eventually, Congress would vote to give out the bonuses 9 years early, overriding Roosevelt's veto. One character who gets to keep his name is the middleman who is sent to make the offer to have Dillenbeck give the speech, a character named MacGuire. In the movie, he's kind of a hapless messenger just there to make the ask and hand off the giant bag of money. The real Gerald MacGuire, Jerry Maguire if you will, had a similar but more active role in the effort to recruit Butler to his cause, promising him a 500,000-strong group of veterans set to march if he just suggested it. MacGuire was sent to Italy and Germany for a few months to study how both now fascist governments utilized veterans to gain power. While the highly placed businessmen who were named in the plot were never officially implicated, MacGuire, who served as the secretary for the Society for a Sound Dollar and Sound Economy, did not escape scrutiny and did not get the protections from the men of means whose bidding he was doing. In either a bit of a coincidence or the realization that they left MacGuire out to dry and he knows where the bodies are buried, MacGuire was found dead at the age of 37 from complications stemming from pneumonia. After Butler's testimony, MacGuire was dismissed as a notorious huckster who often would lie to gain social access. It turns out that the raison d'etre for the members was the decision to move away from the gold standard to a fiat currency. Disappointingly, that's not money backed by a collection of fiats. If you don't happen to know one of those people that have super strong opinions about monetary policy in the US who talks about this at every party, the principles are this. With the gold standard, every dollar represented a dollar worth of gold held in the national treasury, with the gold guaranteeing the value of the dollar. But since you're essentially already taking it for granted that you can take all of your cash to Fort Knox and ask for that much gold, but you won't and probably couldn't, fiat currency allows a central bank to control the amount of money in circulation, and its value is based on the full faith and credit of the government that issued it. The men of power felt like a fiat currency would dilute their money. This is an argument that still happens that I have no opinion on. I majored in the humanities. The gooey candy center for the Society for a Sound Dollar and Sound Currency in the movie is a group calling themselves the Committee of Five. It's even a disturbingly ritualistic method of making deals while walking around in eyes-wide-shut robes. In the business plot, the plotters didn't give themselves a groovy name, especially since they were insisting that they would never try and overthrow the US government. There is a Committee of Five in US history, though, and that was the 5 members of the Second Constitutional Congress who were tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence. One of the shady things the would-be fascist usurpers had their hand in was forced sterilization clinics, which, just from the name, you can imagine is just terrible. Forced sterilization would become popular with fascist governments as part of their eugenics efforts to prevent quote-unquote undesirables from making more quote-unquote undesirables. Unfortunately, that was not an idea that people got from the fascists, but something the fascists picked up from the United States, especially in California, where it was used to curb the Asian population that had been shipped in to help build the railroads. Being an outgroup of any kind could get you on the forced sterilization list. A year before gaining power, the leaders of the fascist movement regarded what was happening in California as a role model. Yeah, not great. Our trio of heroes are made up, but not made up completely. They did stem from Christian Bale and director David Russell looking at historic photographs around key events and pointing to people in the background and wondering what their deal was. For the heiress-turned-bohemian artist, at least her artistic career was based on a number of Surrealist and Dada artists. Dada focuses on the idea of context, and that if you take an object out of its normal context and give it a new one, it has a new meaning. Perhaps best demonstrated by Marcel Duchamp's fountain, which was a urinal placed on its side and signed by Duchamp. More directly, Valerie's artwork is meant to evoke Dada and Surrealist artists like Merritt Oppenheim, whose most famous piece was Object Breakfast in Fur, where she covered up various surfaces of a single teacup set with fur. Oppenheim also created self-portraits in X-ray. The collage element of her art was a nod to Dadaist Hannah Hoch, who pioneered photomontage, which is essentially cutting images out of magazines and papers and placing them over photographs. While it does seem weird for weird's sake, there was a message. The turn of the century came with the ability to replicate photographs on a large scale. This was heralded as a triumph for the truth, as a picture couldn't lie. But the Dadaists argued that pictures absolutely can lie because you're still relying on the journalist to put the picture in context, and that rather than affirming the truth, it was an alarm that we didn't have the tools to separate truth from fiction with the exponential increase in the amount of information available. And if it helps, you weren't supposed to take Fountain seriously. The whole point of it was that it was ridiculous. Bert and Harold meet after being placed together in a predominantly black regiment fighting in World War I. While they are U.S. soldiers, they are not allowed to wear American uniforms because the white soldiers didn't want to fight next to the non-white ones. But France just really wanted Germany to go home and was taking all corners, so they wore French uniforms. This mirrors the Harlem Hellfighters, a regiment made up of black and Puerto Rican soldiers who, for the same reason, were required to wear the French uniforms. World War I was a shock to the system for a Europe that had been in and out of wars for as long as people were writing things down. The war turned out to be so brutal, everyone figured that humanity will have had enough of wars. Yeah, well, Christian Bale's Bert, according to Russell, is based on a real-life doctor named Dr. Shields, but mostly what he reflects is the early facial reconstruction techniques to cover up the disfigurements that were the result of injuries sustained in the war. This was a technique pioneered by Harold Gillies during World War I, going so far as to establish a multidisciplinary group to recreate the faces of soldiers. This would be the beginning of plastic surgery. The lesson seems to have been, don't leave Amsterdam and don't break the magic that bonds the three together. But that means Bert is permanent third wheel status. And given that they were in the lull between Europe-wide conflicts, Amsterdam was going to leave them. Bert might have had it right.